As a student of economics and finance, I have admired this next speaker from afar, and I'm very, very honored to introduce him to our stage this afternoon. Dean Karlan is the Frederick Issa Niemers Distinguished Professor of Economics and Finance at Northwestern University. He's president and founder of Innovations for Poverty Action, co-founder of Stick.com, co-founder of Impact Matters, and a board member of the MIT Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Please join me in welcoming Dean Karlan to the stage.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Thank you for the introduction. You left out my tie-dye business, though. I paid for a year of college selling tie-dyes. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Okay, so I have a few ideas here, hopefully, that I can pack in here. But I know it's the end of the day, so I'm going to do something tacky and put on the professor hat and force you guys to actually raise your hand and do a little audience participation. Well, I won't call on people, though, individually. Am I doing something wrong? Up? No. No. You got to stop the timer, though. This doesn't count against me on the timer. Okay. Which would you choose? Assume you like oranges. 1 for $1 or 4 for $1. Raise your hand if you prefer 1 for $1, please. Raise your hand if you prefer 4 for $1. Very good. Okay. They look like tangerines. We won't hold that against them. Okay. Now we get a nice marketing material from a nonprofit organization that says getting children to school. There's really bad attendance at school and matriculation into schools in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the issues that holds kids back from going to school is they don't actually have the uniforms. Now, we could talk all we want about why require uniforms. Let's not go there. It's the rule. So now, one simple way of helping the kids be able to go to school, get them a school uniform. And so this nonprofit says for $100, we're going to distribute school uniforms to the children so that they can go to school. Nonprofit number 2 says, you know, actually, families don't have the full information about their returns to education. They don't realize that there's this long game, and if they invest in education for their children, that it actually pays off, that this is actually a really good positive return. And so no, you don't need to do school uniforms. Instead, just sit there and hold a meeting and talk about it and say, hey, go to school. Like, there's really good returns. Which do you give to? Say you only have $100, you got to make a choice. Who says school uniforms? Who says information on returns? Who hasn't voted yet? So you're my favorite people. Why? Because that's the right answer. I have not given you enough information to make that choice. I really have not. You should be looking at me going, not enough information. I need to know what is the impact of that per dollar spent and what is the impact of that per dollar spent. Otherwise, it's just blah, 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 words. Maybe I'm really passionate and eloquent, and so this person gets up and tells a great story, and that person is just really wonky and boring and just sits there like this and tells it. And so what? You're going to give to the one who just is, you know, more flamboyant in presentation of the idea? No, that's not what you want to do. Here's the answer in case you're curious. Okay, there we go. Information and returns, much, much better. So you do have school uniforms is good. You know, it's there. It's positive. It beats nothing. But this is much, much better. Okay. It does have some implementation issues. If this was a different lecture, we should go there, which is that in many cases, the returns to education are actually not that good because there's problems in the schools that are deeper. And so it's a little bit of a tricky intervention. But let's not go there. That would be a different topic altogether. I must be aiming the wrong way. Should I aim over here? Or? Okay, so underlying this point is this basic idea that's kind of like, which do you want to drive? The fancy car that sounds great, or the boring one that looks like whatever. And, you know, and the reality is, you can, okay, this is not, that, you know, just because it's fast and sexy and looks great doesn't mean it's going to work. And sometimes the boring idea wins, but I just want to be clear, that doesn't mean the boring idea, I'm not up here telling you the boring idea is the winner. The point is, we need to get evidence and find out what's actually working. So what if we made effectiveness the driver for making decisions, not stories, right? That would be, in my view, a great world. We could allocate resources to the things that are actually really driving the biggest impact. Now, let's take that to the space of building income for the world's poorest. Microcredit, as many know, has been championed for decades. In fact, for Nobel Peace Prize to Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank, and for years had received huge acclaim for increasing income of the world's poorest. But starting about 10 years ago, a lot of controversies arose, and there was many people that criticized it and said, no, it's a problem, that people were being over-indebted, that the interest rates were too high. And here's the logic that both put forward. The advocates for microcredit would stand up and say, hey, these people, we made loans to hardworking entrepreneurial women before they had 2 pigs or 2 goats or a small little stall in a store like this size. And now, 2 years later, after getting a loan, their store is this big, or they have 10 goats and things like this. Right? And the problem, of course, is twofold. You don't know what else changed in that person's life. That maybe there was good economic conditions that drove everything up. You also started off the whole premise by saying you're looking for hardworking people fighting their way out of poverty. If you don't do anything, hardworking people tend to do better than the people who are not so hardworking. Right? So you see an upward trajectory in either one. In the case of the criticisms, the most tragic example were suicides in India that took place, where people said 50 people died, killed themselves, and had microcredit loans. And they blamed the credit on that. Okay, the problem is the logic blaming credit for that was just as flawed as the proponent. For all we know, there were 100 people that were about to kill themselves. And as a last grasp, they got access to a loan that might have solved their problems for them. And for half of them, it actually solved their problem and got them out of the problem they were in that was putting them in such a tragic mode that they were considering suicide. But for half, it didn't solve the problem. And so they still killed themselves. That's a world that I just painted in which microcredit actually saved 50 lives, but instead was being used as evidence that 50 people killed themselves because of it. Now, I don't know which is right? Until I look at evidence and we can set up a test and find out. The reality is that both are deeply flawed analytically. Both are doing what we would call before-after analysis that just tracks an outcome before to after, and then makes the massive leap to say, and we'll just assume that our program caused that change to happen. And the advocates were doing it on the pro, and the critics were doing it on the con. So, here we go. So at the heart of this is a basic question. What should you track? What should you demand as a donor, as a philanthropist? What should you track as an organization, activities or outcomes? And is it smart to track outcomes? And the answer is actually not always. Right? Be very careful. Are you going to actually be able to attribute the change to you? So in the case of suicides, if you were tracking outcomes and that was your outcome, it'd look really bad. In the case of the size of the business, if you were tracking outcomes, you'd say it's really good. Neither one is necessarily the right answer. And the thing you have to ask yourself is, it's expensive to track outcomes. So if you're not going to get the attribution part, if you're not going to actually be able to establish whether you caused that change to happen, then the question you should be asking yourself is, if I'm not learning anything really solid with that data, how much money am I spending on that data? And how many immunizations am I giving up that I could be giving out for free to children? Because there's a cost to those data. They're not free. So if you're not getting it right, maybe you should just think about saying, well, am I doing what I said I would do? And I'll just have to worry about attribution for some other context. Like, I'm not going to be able to show that. But I can show that I'm doing what I said I would do. And then we'll let other people validate whether those activities are actually good activities to do and make sense and generate typically the positive returns that we want to see. That whole slide is kind of a pitch for a book that I have coming out in the May of 2018. called the Goldilocks challenge. And the point of the Goldilocks is how do you get it just right? There's lots of settings where we do want to see outcomes, and we want to see them. I'm going to talk about them in just a moment. But there's many settings where we say, no, actually, tracking outcomes there would actually be the opposite of smart, because you can't establish whether you had anything to do with that outcome at all. And so now you're wasting money, and instead you should just be collecting management data and showing that you did what you said you would do. Okay, so let's go. How do we, when we do track outcome data, what we typically do in the context of things that Opportunity deals with and other social service delivery is we set up randomized trials. And that's really the most straightforward way. It's the same exact discipline that we would demand of prescription drugs in the United States for medicine we take ourselves, and it's taking that same approach to philanthropy. And it's saying, let's find out, by setting up randomized trials, find out how has the world changed because of this program. And to do that, you have to measure how people in a program changed compared to how they would have changed had the program not existed. And that's the entire point of running a randomized trial. So we have, so what have we seen in microcredit? We've seen about 7, 8, 9 microcredit randomized trials so far. And we have seen that there is some evidence that some small businesses do start. We have seen that there's a lot of the money is used not for enterprise. In ways that I would argue make the world a better place. People get choices. They can do something in their home that they couldn't otherwise do. They could buy a TV. They couldn't otherwise do it. But it's not, when we think about what the original aspiration of microcredit was, it was to lift up the world's poorest, building a sustainable source of income for them so that they could, on their own, have more income, more food, more health, more education on average. That actually has not been achieved. And it is not the silver bullet that it was like that I think some hoped it would do. We do not see evidence of people going from no businesses to businesses. There's some evidence of kind of a right tail of a small select set of people that do end up doing much better, but the average result is actually typically flat. The upside is that we don't see the negative evidence as well that was feared. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues with consumer protection that I know a lot of good people are working on. So what to do? Well, the first is innovate on lending. And this is actually an important role for people like you guys in the room. Because, and opportunity, I include that opportunity, but I include donors. Because the reason for not being aggressive and not being innovative is often the donor. It's think about it this way. You didn't get to be the type of person who's sitting in this room by investing in cash your entire life. So take that same approach when thinking about your philanthropy. And you want to push your organizations to be innovative. To say, wait a second, we have this model, we're on to something, we got something going, we're getting our money back, that's great, but now let's figure out how to innovate that model so that it can go back to the original aspiration of building income and figure out what's wrong. So a couple of the ideas that I've seen that do that is to be a little bit more flexible on the lending model. A lot of times microcredit is very rigid, pay back right away. I got my start doing this in investment banking before I went into work for microcredit. And the first thing I noticed in microcredit in 1992, I was like, wait a second, you just told me a story about buying a sewing machine that's going to take 3 to 6 months to start paying off, but yet you're requiring the money in week 1? Like, you know, what I just spent 2 years doing in investment banking was learning how to match cash flows. And yet the microcredit model that was typical was not doing that. And that's an area that groups like Opportunity can be more innovative and try to toy out with different models, but they need the donors to help support that innovation and be willing to take some risks, and that's an important role for you guys. The second is to expand, and I know Opportunity has done some of this. I don't know the full state of where you guys are on this, but is to expand the word microfinance to not just include loans, but to include savings and insurance. And we have seen strong evidence of savings models and insurance models having important impacts. The last is to go back to that original goal of building income and say, well, wait a second. Maybe the problem is deeper. Maybe the problem is not just access to a loan, access to cash. Maybe the problem with poverty is multifaceted, and there's many problems at once. And so when you just do a loan, all you're doing is relaxing the credit constraint that they face, but they face other constraints too. So, you know, what if there's an information constraint, that they don't have the information necessary to figure out what is the right investment? They don't have access to the market. Maybe they don't have the right level of behavioral patterns, hope and aspiration and discipline to take a long-term investment and really see it through. Maybe they don't have sufficient health. Maybe they're low caloric intake, and so they don't have the energy to put in the labor supply necessary. So these are all ideas that say, if these are all true, it's multifaceted, and you can solve one problem, but if the others are there, it doesn't work. And so that's underlying this idea behind the graduation project, which is something which I know Opportunity is now trying in Philippines. I'm excited about that. So the graduation model is a grant-based model. It's not a loan. It's saying, you know what, the reality is the ultra-poor, they're not taking out the loans because it's too risky, and they need these other things along with it. So let's start off when targeting the ultra-poor, who are typically not getting access to microcredit loans, and let's make it a grant-based model. So at the heart of the model is an asset, typically for goats, cow, beekeeping, things like this. But then other things are done as well. Skills, training, 2 years of household visits to help coach the household along the process. And there's a project, I'm down to 9 seconds, so I won't talk about this, but there is a project in the Philippines that I think might be of interest to people here that is also doing this through a faith-based group that is learning about what is the importance of the faith-based aspect of the project over and beyond the program. And so there we randomized whether the faith-based aspect was part of the program. So what have we found? We did this in 7 countries and around the world at roughly the same time. And these are the pooled results. The left side, the bars here are standard deviation units. I'm sorry for going wonky on you guys. But when we look at the pooled results across, this is income and revenue. So and we see about a 0.4, 0.3 standard deviation unit. And this is 3 years. The second bar on each of those things is 3 years after the program ended. So, I'm sorry, after the program started. The program started with the asset transfer, and it's 3 years after that. So it's really getting a good measure of long-run results. Obviously, there's even longer run, which we'd like to know, and we are continuing to measure. But 3 years is a pretty good mark to be able to say whether these results, whether the households were actually able to build a sustainable asset that they themselves were taking care of, and they were on their own. And we look at consumption. We see consumption up by about 0.1, 0.2 standard deviations. These are actually 0.4 standard deviations on income is a huge shift across the distribution of society. Think about, a standard, it probably means they jumped up about 20, 25, 30 percentiles in the distribution of income, which is a huge shift if you think about it within society, be able to shift that much. And we see food security up. I'm cutting short all the other results because of time. It is cost effective. The question you should be asking is, that's great. I know if we give $1 million to a household, we can see positive things happen. So we want to know relative to cost. And 5 of the 6 sites, the benefits exceeded the cost of the program. 100% would be the threshold you want to be over, and 5 of the 6 sites did do better than that. We did want to go back to this original question I put forward, which was to say, well, maybe the problem's deeper than than just one thing. If it's just access to credit, then the problem would have been solved long ago. But we didn't actually. What I just showed you didn't really test that. This does. So here, what we did in Ghana was we had the full program, but then we had a different arm in the study that was randomly assigned that just received goats. So this is the closest thing you get to basically testing if credit, for instance, was going to be able to create these big effects. Then we would see just giving out goats have long-term positive effects. What do we see 3 years later is interesting. We see the households that just get goats keep the goats. The people with the full program also have more goats. But what's interesting is the total livestock value is flat. So the people who got goats 3 years later, total livestock, no change whatsoever. They got rid of other animals. They kept the goats, got rid of other stuff. And likewise, when we look at business revenue, consumption, food security, female power, every single thing, everything else that we look at, we see absolutely no change 3 years after giving them goats. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't better off. They ate some of the animals, they generated some extra food, but 3 years later, we see nothing change of meaning. And so that's the closest we have to being able to test the direct question. Is the problem just access to cash, access to credit, access to liquidity? And that tells us that no, the problem's deeper. And if we address other things at the same time, then we can generate long-run effects that have positive impact on income. So we're now expanding this project, and and I know opportunity has been part of the conversation in the Philippines, and that's where I think that's part of how we ended up hooking up for this talk. And we're seeing a lot of projects around the world take this idea and continue to test. There's a lot of things that we still need to learn. We definitely do not know exactly like how to run this program ideally. And so we're seeing a lot of innovation around the world of groups that are taking the basic model and tinkering. And this is wonderful to see that kind of attention to both innovation and evidence. But we do want to remember, and I don't want to leave you on a sour note, but I do want to point out, as rosy as I am about this, there is no silver bullet. Even this program, if I showed you if I dug a little bit deeper, I would show you some results that showed you that some households did amazingly well with this and others just did okay. Nobody was hurt, so that was good. And the average result was very good. That's what I shared with you, was the average results. But it was very different. A lot of people really ran with this and did amazing, and some other people just did okay. So what's going on there? How do we make that better? So there is no silver bullet, but it's incremental innovation and testing. And recognizing that something inevitably is always going to be better, and to never sit on one's laurels, to be dedicated to getting things right and finding out what works, and not to actually be so dedicated to any one idea, because there's always going to be a better idea. And when that happens, you should be ready to flip over to that one and work on that one until you find something better, and then flip to that one, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So there's lots of questions we're not going to dig in on because I know time's up, that we're asking, and that we're seeing other groups test about cash versus in-kind, doing this with the husband, the wife, doing it collectively, working on how you manage the field agents. These are all questions, people from Opportunity, you guys want to answer any of these questions, that would be awesome. We need to see these kinds of things learned to innovate this program better and learn how to make it work even better. These are the sites for IPA. The blue dots represent where we have country offices, where we partner with groups just like Opportunity. In fact, I've worked with Opportunity before. And that's what IPA, Innovations for Poverty Action, does. We have the projects in all the green countries and country offices in the blue dots. And our role is basically working with groups like Opportunity to set up these tests to help understand what's working, to set up operational tests to figure out how to run the programs better, or to set up impact evaluations of finding out what the impact is. So that's it. Thank you very much, everybody.